Good evening. My name is Peter Raisbeck and I'm an Associate Professor in Architectural Practice at the Melbourne School of Design at the University of Melbourne. And together with my co-convener this evening, Associate Professor Rokas Hinkle, we are thrilled to be hosting this discussion that forms part of the Politics in Utopia panel series during Melbourne Design Week. We begin this discussion by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which this event is taking place, which may be multiple lands given the location of all of you. I'm currently speaking from Wurundjeri land and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and the place of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy.
Our conversation series, Politics and Utopia in Architecture, explores pressing issues of our times, from social injustice to overconsumption, from climate change to the effects of capitalism. We like to reflect on learnings and lessons for architects and designers and as citizens of a globalized world, together with ethnographers, environmentalists, Indigenous elders, activists, artists and architects, designers and planners, theorists and historians, as well as philosophers. Previous conversations include Indigenous knowledge system, learning from the Anthropocene, and shaping future societies. I also like to invite you today already for our next panel discussion on March 25, this time live from the National Gallery of Victoria, where Peter and I will discuss with panelists how we can decolonize architectural education.
Today we discuss the post-pandemic Anthropocene. The Anthropocene has come to be quickly adopted as a term to describe a new geological epoch of the Earth that is entirely dominated by humans. The Anthropocene presupposes the idea that nature and human society are inextricably entwined. To discuss this, I'm delighted to welcome this distinguished panel joining us this evening. And this panel brings together a really fabulous and diverse group of people with expertise in climate and development, public health and planning, as well as a notable artist and film director. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Bon Mart, sculptor, performance artist and curator. Bon is a sculptor creating transdisciplinary process-driven installations activated by performance. These are informed by learning from Indigenous knowledge and ideas of the trickster, nurturing through collaboration, quantum physics, and the queer ecologies of lightning, philosophy, and looking back to a path forward for expanded, inclusive social change. So I'm very excited to hear what Bon has to say, because I think her take on the entanglement of humans and nature is a really interesting one. And of course, Bon alerted me to the fact that Nikola Tesla had in fact married the pigeons, which I found really, really interesting. I'd also like to introduce Simon Rose, who is a director of his own freelance Indigenous media production service, The Great Aboriginal People. Simon is a Bira Gurung Gurung person working across documentary, corporate video and other commissioned content for several years, including freelance writing, producing and directing. Simon was the Indigenous director's attachment to ABC TV's Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries from 2011 to 2012, and he completed a factual research internship with Blackfellas Films in Melbourne 2015 to 16. He was a participant in Screen Australia's National Indigenous Producing Initiative of 2016 and directed the NITV commission film Our Stories, Marie Clark, Cultural Warrior in 2018. And in 2019, as I've just said, he started his own freelance Indigenous media production service. And I think it's great to have Simon on this panel. Thank you so much. And it's great to get the perspective of someone working in media and film with Indigenous knowledge. Thank you, Simon.
We pose to the panel the proposition that the COVID-19 virus is the ultimate entanglement of humans and nature. We will then pursue the following questions. After the global pandemic, how has our knowledge of the Anthropocene changed? What do our experiences of the pandemic now tell us about remaking the Anthropocene through design and spatial practices? Is it just a matter of designing with new technological fixes for our cities, building and spaces? The discussion might go somewhere else, but these were the prompts we started when we started the discussion before this live panel. This panel will thus explore how the pandemic has changed our views on post-pandemic design theory and practice. Has the pandemic enabled us to see more clearly our own hubris and to speak to the future of the Earth? It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Melanie Lowe, Research Fellow at the Melbourne Centre for Cities at the University of Melbourne. Melanie's research investigates how to plan healthy and resilient cities and the use of indicators to monitor and inform policy. She works at the interface of the public health and urban planning fields, highlighting the co-benefits that can be achieved for human health, sustainable development, livability, and urban resilience. Melanie works collaboratively with researchers and policymakers across a range of disciplines. In her current role, she is part of a partnership with the City of Melbourne to co-design research to enhance the resilience of Melbourne. Her research has been included in local, state, and federal planning and public health policies in Australia. Welcome, Melanie. It's also my pleasure to welcome Dr. Janine Felsen, Enterprise Fellow of the former Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, MSSI, at the University of Melbourne. Janine's primary focus is on integrating global policy for sustainable development, climate change, and the ocean through new or improved financial frameworks and government structures. Prior to joining MSSI in the University of Melbourne, as Belize's Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations, she played a leading advocacy role on behalf of the Caribbean community and the Alliance of Small Island States for integrated and coherent approaches to address the unique circumstances of small island developing states across the development, environment, and security agendas, including the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Paris Agreement, and related decisions, and in the current negotiations for a new high seas treaty on marine biodiversity. Welcome, Janine.
Each panelist will give us a 10-minute overview of their experiences and perspectives on the discussion topic of the post-pandemic Anthropocene. And we will be in order of Melanie Lowe first, then Janine, then Mart, and finally Simon. We will then lead off with, after that, a panel discussion. So to begin with, welcome, and again, Melanie, and we'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Peter and Rockers. Delighted to be on the panel to discuss this really interesting topic. My research interest is planning healthy cities and how policies across a whole range of sectors, so housing, urban planning, transport, economic development, open space planning, and community services, so the full range, how they can support the creation of healthy urban environments. So I'm interested in how environments shape human health and what we can do via city planning to maximise benefits for human as well as planetary health. So my background is in public health, so I come at questions about urban environments and spatial planning from a health and wellbeing perspective. And this has been both a fascinating as well as a troubling time to be working in urban public health in this COVID-19 era, as we've seen the pandemic impact urban populations early, very rapidly and catastrophically. So I know today that we're discussing the post-pandemic Anthropocene in this panel, but I would in fact argue that in fact we're still in the COVID era, particularly here in Australasia. So focusing on cities and human and urban contexts in the Anthropocene, and particularly in this COVID era Anthropocene, is important given that the majority of the world's population now live in urban areas for the first time in human history. And we know that Australia is a highly urbanised population. This means that urban areas are the major human habitat and so vital for our health and wellbeing. But activities in cities and urban areas are also the source of a lot of environmental issues, a major source of global greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity loss and other environmental issues. So cities are certainly a place of human flourishing, and that's the reason why we've seen patterns of urbanisation globally. But we also know that they present risks for human health, things such as sedentary lifestyles, poor air quality, road trauma, and we now know infectious disease spread. So COVID-19 has really reminded us about the close relationship between cities and our health. Modern city planning was indeed born out of a concern to limit the spread of infectious diseases in growing industrial cities. Non-communicable diseases, things such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes and cancer, have since become the leading urban health threat globally. But infectious disease risk never went away and has now reared its head in a major way in the form of this current pandemic. So COVID-19 has re-emphasised that interconnected nature of humans and their environment. Humans are having a pervasive impact on our natural environment, and that is a large part due to our built environments, which is in turn impacting our health and wellbeing. COVID indeed was born out of the interaction between humans, animals and the wider environment, and has then been subsequently spread through urban environments. In many cities, COVID has prompted a rethink of some aspects of city planning. So we've seen some really positive things. So many jurisdictions around the world have been, actually including here in Australia, have been prompted to make new investments in reclaiming space previously taken up by car parks, for example, and making them into public spaces, building new cycling infrastructure or accelerating social housing programs. So these things are really great for health through a range of different pathways. But other city planning responses to the pandemic present risks for human health and wellbeing, and also for the environment. So, for example, knee-jerk responses to prioritise low-density housing to increase our social distance during a pandemic could potentially have detrimental impacts. It's not necessarily density per se, which in fact can be the building block of healthy and livable communities. That is the problem. We know that it's more about how we design that density and how we prevent overcrowding. And we've also seen social isolation during lockdowns and also, for example, heat exposure of vulnerable public housing residents stuck at home without air conditioning. And concerningly, a temporary, if not more long-term, shift away from public transport use with negative impacts on carbon emissions. The pandemic has also really highlighted urban health inequities. So there's been a long-term concern about unfair access to opportunities and health risks in our cities. So, for example, in Australia, I've worked with a large team of researchers to map spatial access to urban design and transport features across our major cities. And we know, for example, that access to public transport, walkable environments, livable environments, is inequitably distributed, favouring the inner city in many cities. During lockdowns, it was walkable, livable environments that were still able to provide healthy environments for residents. Open space and parks became vitally important during lockdowns, but not everyone had access to local, high-quality green space for connection with nature and physical activity within the distances specified in lockdowns in Melbourne, for example. So we really need to learn from positive city planning innovations during COVID-19, address inequities and avoid locking in unsustainable and unhealthy environments. COVID-19 is a major disruption to urban systems and lifestyles, and it's my hope that we can harness this as an opportunity to move things into the right direction. So some city leaders around the world have really reinvigorated ideas of creating healthy and sustainable 15 or 20-minute neighbourhoods as part of COVID-19 recovery. And a lot of what is driving that is concern about the environment, health, as well as economic recovery. So Paris and Milan, for example, have instigated and accelerated those ideas. We know that the C40 group of cities has also called for 15-minute cities post-COVID as part of a green recovery. And these ideas were pleasingly really prominent in urban policy in Melbourne and Sydney, for example, even pre-pandemic. So this notion of the 15 or 20-minute city made up of complete neighbourhoods where everything is within a short distance, 20 minutes, say, of home by walk, biking, trip or public transport journey, really encapsulates the vision of healthy and sustainable cities. It's about local, low carbon and active living. So in planning these types of neighbourhoods, we need to be thinking really clearly about the co-benefits for health as well as reducing greenhouse gas emissions and for optimising opportunities to create resilient cities, including climate resilient cities. So resilience to shocks and stresses is increasingly important in the Anthropocene and in our urban contexts. We know that shocks, for example, pandemics, as well as floods, bushfires and heat are becoming more common and more severe. Their impact is also felt more strongly where we have chronic urban stresses such as unaffordable housing, social inequality and food insecurity. So we need to think about preparedness to crises and how we build resilience to both known as well as unknown or unpredicted shocks and stresses. And this is a really important aspect of planning healthy cities in the Anthropocene. So research on urban resilience and disaster preparedness is something that I'm now working on in close collaboration with the City of Melbourne in my current role. And it's really fantastic to see the City of Melbourne and other governments and jurisdictions around the world so committed to addressing these concerns.
Great, thank you so much, Melanie. I've got a few questions I can ask you, but we might leave those till the end. And I think we'll now move on to Janine.
I hope you can hear me well. And probably the cockatoo in the background. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And of course, I wish to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from where I Zoom and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm very pleased to follow after Melanie, because I think if you wanted a global perspective of how we can view this issue of the pandemic, and I completely agree with Melanie, we're not post-pandemic. In fact, if you look in many parts of the world, we're very much in the height or near in the thick of it. In some cases, we see very low vaccination rates, and one certainly has concerns about that. But you take what Melanie just said and you blow it up globally. Australia, of course, is technically a first world country. I work in the space of dealing with developing countries. And as you indicated in my bio, I work with small island developing states. I've worked with them for over 20 years. And many of the issues that small island developing states have weathered and continue to weather are issues that globally are challenges. Small island developing states have always used themselves as sort of the test case, the canary in the coal mine of what needs to be done, the benchmark of ambition of what needs to be done at a global scale. Because what we experience now in islands, in low-lying coastal states, are the very experiences that have come to manifest themselves in the world with climate change impacts and all the other stressors that urban environments face. So I want to tackle this issue from a global scale, of course, because that is the area within which I work. And And I'm going to look at the lessons and challenges. And I think at the global scale, many of the lessons are very reminiscent of a not too distant crises that the world faced in 2008, 2009, which was the world economic and financial crises. And at that point in time, there were global systems, human systems that were collapsing, economic and financial systems that were collapsing. Countries were falling into recession. Some, as in the small island developing states, were still coming out of recession when the pandemic hit. It disrupted everything. We had the same narrative that we have now. It's an unprecedented time to make unprecedented change, and we did nothing or very little. You can choose your argument. So the global systems continue to persist. They continue to be ill-suited for the type of events that are becoming now more common, climate events that we're seeing. The pandemic that we are now in is not the last pandemic that we will see. It's expected that we can see more in the future, depending on how we manage our relationship with nature. But our systems were created in a post-World War II era, where power dynamics were very different. Some countries weren't independent at the time. The countries that were independent at the time had very limited political economy to have any influence on decision-making. Currently, there are 5 countries in the world who make decisions, who influence decisions at the United Nations. 5 countries. The world looks very different now than it did just after World War II. The institutions that were set up, the financial institutions were set up to address rebuilding Europe. We're looking at a completely different world now, where rebuilding has to occur everywhere. It has to occur in the developing countries, because we simply cannot withstand, with our own resources, with our very limited capacity, human resources, technological, we're not able to address the types of changes that we're seeing. Yes, there are some positive things that we can build on. Countries have their indigenous culture, their knowledge systems, their practices, but they're not complicit with global systems. So the systems have to be planned, they have to change for this new world. It's not new, a different context, different challenges. We have to think of that in terms of the financial institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. We have to think about that in relation to the United Nations, which has been now in maybe 2-3 decades reform process, and it still hasn't reformed much. And we have to think about it in terms of environmental frameworks that influence the global policy level, but also impact. They have a relationship at the national level and reverse. There's a national to global perspective that we need to bear in mind. The challenge, of course, will be our decision-making processes. It's a challenge at the local level, at the national level. How do we bring in stakeholders? How do we make the vulnerable populations' voices matter? They're not just consulted for the purposes of ticking a box. The same thing applies at the global level. Vulnerable voices, like those of small island developing states, matter. But they're consulted by just ticking a box. We've consulted, we've spoken, but then the decisions get taken elsewhere. How do we change that? There are lessons, of course, positive, and Melanie highlighted at the urban national level, what lessons have been learned there. I think it's important to think also that there were really unprecedented decisions taken in very short period of time. There was a mobilization of over $13 trillion for stimulus to help with recovery. That's a major amount of money that could really make a difference with climate change if we had that type of resources channeled towards the right things. there was a pause to rethink. And we were probably still in a little bit of a pause to rethink how we can rearrange our relationship with each other, but also definitely at the national and local levels. And I think these are very important lessons that have been learned. But will we fall in the same pattern that we did in 2008, 2009, where we had that unprecedented opportunity and we absolutely did nothing much or little to make a difference? In November of last year, everyone had their eyes on Glasgow in Scotland. That was a moment to make a difference. And yes, there were lots of signaling that things could be different. But in the end, the results were perhaps lackluster, less than we wanted. So I think really what we're facing right now is a challenge. It's a challenge that COVID-19 has certainly underscored and brought to our attention. It's a challenge that it's not just at the global scale that we need to address it. It is at it's a multi-scalar challenge. So yes, even for the urban theorists and the designers and the planners, as Melanie is mentioning with respect to the relationship for building healthy environments. The challenge is, how can we make our human systems respond to the natural system? So I would turn the whole idea of this Anthropocene on its head. That it's not us dominating. It's really the natural systems now that we have to respond to, that we have to address in order that we can, in fact, have present and future generations living in healthy environments, healthy cities, healthy rural areas, where we have a healthy ocean that continues to underpin this world that depends on it. How do we do that? That's the challenge that we have. So I'll leave it at that, Rokas. I'm really, I know that my perspective is very different from the different levels that will be addressed here, but I'm excited to be a part of the panel and to take on some questions and even ask some questions of my own. Thank you.
Thank you, Janine. You're asking the big question of the system and the globalized world, and I think that's really what we have to address. And maybe that panel can have a little bit of addressing it. And I'm looking forward to discussing your points. But I hand over now to Mart to introduce their thoughts. Over to you, Bon.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen. I've invited Simon to join me with this, talking about my practice. And firstly, I'd like to, Simon and I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people and their continuing connection to country and community. We acknowledge their land, sea, and sky were never ceded. We pay deep respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island and First Nations people and elders past, present, and future. Simon and I have been collaborating for quite some time, and well, actually it feels like quite some time because we've crammed a lot in, and this is an image of us having discussions at an exhibition that's currently on at Mejia Gallery, located in Tinning Street in Brunswick. And this particular show really, it describes the multi-levels of my practice. But in essence, today where we are, to create social change is a really complex concept. And if I researched the work of Luce Irigaray, and she suggests that Luce Irigaray is a philosopher and a psycholinguist, and she suggests that artists have the capabilities of creating social change. So therefore, as an artist, I feel I have a responsibility to create or to contribute to positive social change. And one of the ways that my practice is doing that is by looking back to go forward. And by looking back, I'm learning from Indigenous knowledge and I'm learning from Indigenous science. I'm also looking back to where the word human came from, and looking back to, I was born in Turtle Island, and when Turtle Island was invaded by Columbus, he would have been carrying two major texts that were very popular in the 1400s. And these particular texts were also accompanied by major, paper bulls that were disseminated by the Catholic Church. And the paper bulls authorized Western Europe to invade countries and to kill, torture, and or indoctrinate anyone that was not Christian. So, and because the problem, I'd also like to reference one of my mentors, Guillermo Gomez Pena, who's a performance artist. He suggests that the system is the problem, so we can't change the system from within. So I'm learning from Indigenous knowledge because I'd like to just continue to the next slide. So my practice learns from identifying as a ghost of a man who said he was lightning between the AC and the DC. The AC and DC, I look at being an energy system. He was referring it to being the band AC/DC. This inquiry of lightning has led me to learn about the science of lightning and the origins of lightning, which has led me to learn about astronomy from an Indigenous and Western astronomy perspective to create positive social change. So Indigenous science is known as deadly science. So I'm really excited to have Simon here, and this is a screen grab from Simon's website. Simon, would you like to say a few words?
Thanks, Bon. Yeah, so basically, I'm a filmmaker, and I'm really glad to be involved in this discussion. And, you know, I'm coming at it from an Indigenous perspective, which is primarily about, well, multiple things, but relationships fundamentally, and relationships to people, and to the subject we're talking about today, the Anthropocene, about relationships to environment and how humans interact with that environment. And that's one of the major key aspects of the work that I'm engaged in terms of films and filmmaking. It's about connecting with those people. And a lot of the artists I work with, Indigenous artists, it's also very much about rejuvenation and reclamation of connection to country and bringing country to life, which I think is very important in terms of discussion we're having today.
Simon, we've been talking about extraction as well. And just extracting from the earth, and I thought that would be good to talk about. Yeah,
and we had discussions about these different models that get utilized, you know, the capitalist model, the extractive model, Indigenous models, etc., relationship to land, and what kind of practices they use, what kind of systems of sustainability that they have in place, responsibilities, obviously, and then consequences. We don't often talk much about, those kinds of outcomes, consequences. And I think, like fundamentally, we don't have that advocacy for environment or, these important cultural aspects of, Indigenous perspectives on things at that higher level, government policy level, the way, industry lobbyists and groups do.
So I also wanted to invite the audience to have a look at the website Intangible Heritage Trust. And they've, in that website, they've got the importance of learning from intangible cultures or intangible knowledge cultures. I think part of the problem of where we are is that our society focuses on the tangible and the archive. And I think a way forward is to embrace the intangible and really look at ways that we can be activists within that. And one of the ways that I was trained as a sculptor, and I did my undergrad and master's in sculpture, and so I'm trained to weld and cast and all of those archival materials. But at the moment, I'm doing process-driven installations activated by performance to challenge traditional Western educational protocols of framing and installing artworks by installing from the ceiling. I also identify as, I'm just going to go to the next slide. This is a screen grab from my website. Over to the top left is my name, Bon Mart, and then you'll see the _//. I also identify as that symbol, as well as lightning and non-binary and neurodiverse, I have to say. So you can go through my website if you like. The first 6 images are the that you see there are recent projects, well, pretty much all in 2022. And so the // and underscore is a way for me to depart from pronouns, because I think we also need to question language as a way of, if we're looking at the Anthropocene, we should be definitely questioning language. And one of the ways I'm questioning language is learning learning from Indigenous languages that are often not gendered. In particular, I'm researching Lakota language. I just thought I'd do a little screen grab of, it's quite hard to see here, but so can you see that, or is it just? So this is the actual etymology of the word human. So I depart from the word human because basically, so I just in 1789, during the human rights, when the civil rights document was being prepared, Olympia de Gouges in 1791 wrote the Declaration of Rights for Women, and she was decapitated for doing this in 1793. The word human is a really recent word, and it was derived from this particular word in Latin, which is basically, it's a thick brown substance. It's basically describing topsoil. And my practice questions really what the word human is, and I would argue that human means being white, privileged, and male, or identifying as that, because those who weren't white, privileged, and male when the word human was developed certainly didn't have human rights. And so I actually, I'm in the examination stage of my PhD, and which is the reason I'm still in the examination stage is because of COVID. One of the examiners is very unwell, and yeah, so during my PhD research, I really needed to research lightning and what human actually means. And I said to Peter when he invited me initially that the word Anthropocene is deeply problematic, and I really respect the works of people like Elizabeth Povinelli, who was invited to collaborate with an Indigenous film group to question the Anthropocene. And, you know, certainly Indigenous cultures did not destroy the planet, or certainly nowhere near as where we are now, where in the last, well, even in the last 50 years, we've had such an incredibly massive increase of extinction in animals. And I think that's really important, that we acknowledge that we are animals. We're not a different species, you know, we are actually part of the animal kingdom, and we're completely dependent on other animals for our survival. So I just wanted to, this is some text to really look at all the different components of my work. But one of the key points why I wanted to invite Simon to work with me, and I work with other First Nations artists, is in order to slow down the rate of extinction, our own extinction, I urge everyone to learn Indigenous knowledge. So Simon, is there anything that you wanted to include from what I've said?
I just wanted to highlight very quickly, like a story, like there's lots and lots of stories about, you know, Indigenous connection to land and how we managed it, you know, through fire stick farming, through, you know, some forms of kind of replanting of vegetables and yams and stuff like that. There's a myriad of those stories, but one of the ones I wanted to kind of talk about quickly was I used to work in the Queensland Museum, and we used to have elders come from all parts of the country from Queensland to visit us and look at the collection. And we had this one fellow come down one day from North Queensland, and he was looking at the spears collection, and we brought them out for him, and he was telling us about the markings on them. And he was saying that there was a section on the end of a spear that was painted white. And he was saying, do you know why that's there? And we said, well, no, don't know. And he said, well, that's there because when you're throwing at another person, you're in a fight with that other person, you're giving that person a chance to see the spear coming, the white spear is coming, you know, the white section, you can see it easily. And you can have that opportunity to kind of get out of the way if you need to. So there's this underlying principle of fairness and kind of not wanting to destroy, in a sense, you know, opposition and that kind of a thing. And there's a whole bunch of complex, you know, ideas that exist within Indigenous, you know, thought processes. But that's one that's kind of really interesting in terms of how we, you know, negotiate with other parties and interested bodies, you know, industry, capitalism, all these other kinds of things that we have to negotiate, working spaces with them, you know, and what are the outcomes of that, you know? Is it going to be completely destructive? We're going to just walk all over everybody else. We're just going to take everything, or are we going to figure out a way to work, you know, to cohabit, you know, in a future space together?
Thank you, Simon. So I've got an exhibition on until the 26th of March, and it's entitled "She Makes My Heart Race," which is a line from Ronald Belford Scott's song "She's Got Balls," and it really looks at the Holy Trinity of Christianity, which I see as sexism, racism, and capitalism. And I think if we are able to depart from the Holy Trinity, we might have a chance to slow down extinction. Thank you.
Okay, that was fantastic. I have got some questions. I think Bon and Simon have thrown up some really interesting points that we can then talk to, I guess, Melanie and Janine about. I think this idea of the intangible is really quite interesting. And I think both Melanie and Janine suggested that, you know, when we're dealing with cities, when we're dealing with the Anthropocene, we shouldn't just be ticking boxes. So I think the question, I might start with you, Melanie, if that's all right. When you talk about developing our cities around neighbourhoods, how do you think they might account for the intangible?
Oh, it's a very good question, and perhaps Bon and Simon would be in a better position to answer that, given they've grappled with that a bit more. I feel like, you know, neighbourhood planning, city planning is often very reduced to the tangible. And so it's an important thing to take stock, step back and think about those intangibles. But yes, it's not often part of the conversation. You know, in spatial planning, we often are very much thinking about, you know, the concrete positioning of infrastructure, services, you know, the layout of neighbourhoods. And it's all very physical, very spatial. Yeah. Does anyone else on the panel have something to add?
Yes, I would like to add to that. It's been a big part of my research over the last. I started learning Indigenous knowledge in the year 2000 when I shared a studio with filmmaker Rachel Perkins, and it was then that I decided to design a prefab building which learns from Indigenous knowledge, which is creating a building that has, I've got a patent on it, and it's been a very long project. So creating a building that has telescopic legs, meaning that they all adjust, and so you don't need to put a slab down. And then once you all the components can be carried in, so that you don't need a crane or lifting equipment, and all the parts can be carried by hand and installed by an untrained person. It would need to be cyclone rated and then also disassembled, not leaving a trace. And the reason I decided to design something like this is that could be easily put into someone's backyard so people could share the land. And I think that's something that could be really brought into town planning. Can you share your land? You know, I know that you need 2 titles to, you know, officially have, you know, 2 buildings. But I think, you know, people post-pandemic are actually starting to share their land. They're starting to divide their houses so they can, maybe they need to look after an elderly person, or they've lost their income stream. So that, yeah, I think if there was a possible way, or actually, Melanie, I'd like to ask you how we could share our, you know, because I mean, the whole idea of ownership of land is crazy when we're living on stolen land to begin with. So how can we share, how can people that own their land, quote unquote, share, you know, possibly share it?
Yeah, and I think it goes to that, you know, the fundamental question around, you know, the affordability of housing and the human, shelter is a basic human right, and yet we have real issues around private ownership being a barrier to people having adequate shelter in our country, and in a high income setting, and similar, and yet different issues experienced right across the world. So there's all sorts of models that you hear about sort of, co-housing and sharing in different ways to ensure that we do give everyone more of a fair go in our current sort of, housing system. But the one thing I would also say is that we've got to be careful as we potentially, whether it's sharing or still through private ownership, we are tending to, as we densify, lose some of our nature, because nature can be privately owned in people's backyards, front yards, body corporates, and if we cut off your backyard and put another house, that can actually reduce the green cover in our cities and reduce the biodiversity for all other plants, animals, insects that we share our urban areas with. So, yeah, I think there's lots in that. I certainly don't have any answers around how do we better divide up the public and the private and through sharing. But Bon, that's a really fantastic example of innovation, I would say, that you're talking about, your design.
Can I just jump in very quickly?
Yes, I want to bring you back
Janine.
in, Janine, actually, because I think what everyone discussed and talked about is also, everyone's mentioning the system.
Yes.
And it's the system which Janine mentioned is like, a post-World War II Western system of continuous growth, private ownership, personal gain, big capitalism. And I think when we talk about what, Melanie talked about, infrastructure, that's part of that system. And, how we deal with these smaller aspects of this is still working within that system. I think what Bo and Simon brought into the discussion was the Indigenous knowledge and a very different attitude to relationships and environments. And I think that's when I want to bring Janine back into. I had the hope 2008 we would change our financial system, because that's basically the underlying currency of everything we're doing. That didn't happen. Now we had we still have, as everyone correctly mentioned, the pandemic. But you can see that it's basically, again, working on the financial system, pumping more money into economy, back into the system of continuous growth and personal gain. Where is there an hope, Janine, that we actually get out of this system? Do we have to have a complete system failure, which then will be the post-human? Or how long do we have to wait? Or what can we do to actually change it? I mean, we're trying to change it through this, we're trying it through research, we're trying it through education, but it seems to be like, larger interests, which are mainly about financial systems, are really holding us back here.
Well, there's no one answer, number one. Two, I think it's really fascinating to bring together this panel with quite diverse perspectives of engaging with an issue with a view to transforming, how we engage with nature and with people and with our cities. So I always, I've always struggled with this question about whether or not, in when you look at civil rights movement, human rights on a global scale, what came first? Was it the body politic, or was it the legislative framework that we then created and that then catalyzed transformation? It's very difficult to determine that. But I like to look at the decision-making processes. There is growing recognition that stakeholder engagement is, and we hear things like co-design, co-create, co-collaborate, which is important. Those decision-making processes are absolutely key. And that's where you start bringing in the different voices. And it's not just ticking the box, right? because then what you do is you also need to have something at the back end, which is more of a monitoring type of infrastructure. So you're seeing, okay, we had all of this come in from, these different groups. We've looked at how to manage it within a policy or a decision that's been taken. And then you have to account for that. That's really very critical. I want to touch on the finance issue because that's what drives our societies, right? That's what drives the decisions to, if we're going to invest on improving, our coastal infrastructure, if we're going to invest in a city, in a certain neighborhood, if we're going to put public transportation, those processes can go positively and they can go negatively, but it's driven a lot by finance. And there is this push, and it was something that was hardwired into the Paris climate regime, which is to have all financial flows move towards climate resilient, low emissions development pathways. And that applies across the board, not just to states, but also to non-state actors, businesses, etc. And here's where I think, things like, harnessing the type of positive engagement from artists, and artists is, not just one type of artist, there are many different artists, harnessing the calls and the actions from even the youth climate movement, harnessing the knowledge of bringing in, I don't like the word harnessing when I speak about Indigenous peoples and local communities, because it's more just ensuring that they're at the table. Bringing that together really can push what we're trying to do at the global level to shift finance flows towards these ideas of low emission, climate resilient pathways, and also within the context of a specific goal of trying to keep global warming below 1.5. So I think those two components, the decision-making processes, not just for the sake of ticking boxes, but that has an actual follow-up part to it. And then bringing together, the movement or the momentum to have the change with what is now defining our sort of trajectory in terms of finance related decision making at the global level, trying to bring those two together in order to really influence how we might rethink and redirect where we want to put money. The big issue though is can we do this fast enough? That a way back to go forward. It's a really, I think, a very important thing to kind of underline what we are doing, but it's the pace. It's, we need to really accelerate the pace of what we're doing to make a difference in many of these areas. And it'll be interesting to hear, how do we deal with that type of pace issue?
Janine, I was curious just whether you saw any glimmers of hope in the sort of the drive for economic recovery post-COVID, and whether that is to any extent accelerating the sort of shift in investment in green technology and the transition to a green economy, or whether you're seeing that there's been really no momentum as part of those COVID recovery activities on the international scale, I suppose.
Yeah, it's hard to make a sort of a nexus between what's occurring and the pandemic, but certainly, I mean, I think in terms of e-mobility, there's been a lot of signs that this is really transitioning. There's also the energy transition with discussions, and renewable energy continues, the cost of renewable energy continues to fall relative to fossil fuel production. And yet, we have a war upon us, and that has almost changed the way we're going to think. I don't want to be a pessimist at all. because, you know, that we have to look for those opportunities that symbolize hope. And I think in many ways, there are some glimmers of hope in relation to some of the energy transition related issues that we need to address. Where we need a little bit more focus is on adaptation and resilience. And you would know a lot more about that, Melanie. Funding for adaptation, it's not a business case, but you have to make a business case to adapt, even though it's something that's you know, required for us to be able to live in our homes without being, you know, inundated with floodwaters. Adaptation and planning and ensuring you have a plan for the short, but also for the long term, that needs to be there. So that aspect, so there's some glimmer of hope for some of the energy related stuff, regardless of the fact that yes, we're in the middle of a war on Europe, and it's having an impact on fossil fuel use. But even before that, with the recovery, even the International Energy Agency has said we're actually going to see even higher emissions in 2021 than we had before the pandemic. Anyways, that's a different issue. So you are seeing some glimmers of hope on one side. We also need to address the other side of the adaptation and resilience component of our building resilient
on the question of resilience, can I ask Simon, because I think, you know, Melanie, you're talking about resilience in the kind of, you know, the smaller neighborhoods, but then again, that's an infrastructural point of view and a kind of, you know, supply or offer. But what Simon talked about is really relationships to environment and amongst people. And I think, you know, resilience we only can create if we actually create strong communities. So I would like to prompt Simon on also from that indigenous perspective to talk about how we can shift our Western view of, you know, private backyard and shared facilities or shared grounds and building resilience as a community.
Yeah, thanks, Ruckus, for bringing me in. Yeah, I wanted to add something to that point you were talking about, Janine, very quickly, which was a real cynical view of it was I saw a great documentary about an American company that made carpets, and they talked about how they were transitioning to you know, environmentally friendly materials, etc., and all this kind of stuff. But it was such a well laid out plan. It just seemed like they'd spent, you know, 40, 50 years in their company kind of doing whatever kind of damage they could do, wanted to do, you know, regardless. And then they had a new kind of, you know, investment strategy of how they were going to do all the sustainable, you know, carpets. And it was this, me being very cynical, it was this model of like, well, capitalism is just going to sell us the new model of how we get out of these problems, you know, which I found very, very scary. And that's one of my bigger points is that, you know, when you're looking at the indigenous models that existed, you know, it's not to say that they didn't have problems or they didn't fight with each other or they didn't do resource extraction. They did, but there were relationships there and there were limitations quite a lot of the time. And there was responsibilities and consequences that came out of those relationships. And there was just things you weren't allowed to do. You know, you couldn't go and burn down your next door neighbor's trees or whatever, because one, it's morally you wouldn't want to do that. Two, you know, your daughter might be married to the next door neighbor's son or something like that. And also you just destroyed all of these trees. You know, you're not going to get the kangaroos over there. They're going to be somewhere else. So it affects you, and there's a direct relationship between how it affects you and them, and you're both in this balance of, you know, no one interest group is kind of, you know, over the other in a sense. You know, that's a simplistic way of looking at it. Not to say that Aboriginal societies didn't have those, you know, other balances and whatnot, but you know, we don't really have that in the sense, you know, the point I was making earlier is that we don't have the same kind of lobbying power that a corporation has, you know, at a high political level, you know, to kind of get our point of view across until the situation becomes dire and, you know, we're left with no result what to do about it. It's a money-making game, isn't it? We're so far down the rabbit hole. It's like, they don't really come on board unless you figure out a way for them to make money on the way out.
And I think that's a good point. I like the analogy of so far down the rabbit hole that it's almost impossible to get out. Some of you might want to comment on that. But I'm wondering, is it an issue of timing and the way that we think about time? Because I know, Janine, you said that after the last GFC, you thought there was a sort of wasted opportunity there. And maybe in the sort of international financial and multilateral system, they thought that we could just kick things down the road a bit more or just go back to what we already had. So I think there's a sort of timing thing there. And I guess there's also a timing thing, are we too attracted to the quick fix? Are we too attracted to the time that to get a return on investment tomorrow or next week, which then forecloses bringing in other voices, which then forecloses developing advocacy amongst our stakeholders. So I think you might have something to say about that, Janine. I'm just wondering what you think of that issue of time in the global system and how it might be better.
That's a great question, because we probably do have across the globe very, very different views of timing and how quickly a decision needs to have to be operationalized to have impact. So if you're coming from a small island developing state, we don't have time. And I say we because I'm from Belize. It's not an island. It's a low-lying coastal state, but it's considered a small island developing state because of the similarities and characteristics. We don't have 10 years to wait. So we actually do need some type of immediacy in the responses that or the action. Sorry, not even responses. The action that we will need to take. Others might have a little bit more breathing space or breathing room because bigger land, larger economies. If you ever look at an image of Hurricane Dorian, which is a Category 5 hurricane over the Bahamas, you wouldn't know that there was an island, a country under there. It was multiple times the size of that one island, even though that island has many other islands. So our idea of temporal scale is very different from what perhaps would obtain in the US or in another country that has very different resources and very different abilities to cope with the impacts that we're seeing, environmental, but also social impacts, very different. So at the global scale, I think there are differences of views. There is now, however, you all would have seen the recent Working Group 2 report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which reinforces what was said last year, that we have such a narrow window of opportunity, and we're talking decades, to make a difference. And even at that level, with the last report itself, there was a call that we need to make sure that we have climate resilient development that is inclusive. It has a justice, it has a social justice component to it. So I think that that idea that temporal scale is beginning to shift, it's beginning to come into perspective, that we need urgent action. And it's not urgent action in 2050 for net zero, it's urgent action at least to 2030. And that urgent action will not come from the state alone. It requires multi-level, multi-scale contributions, and locally led initiatives are going to be very key to that. I know here, states have their plans, and then there's a federal overlay, but the states are doing developing their climate efforts. I mean, all these scales are beginning to align, let's just put it that way. And it's going to be very critical, because that too will impact on financial investment flows. That too will impact on, okay, we actually, if we're going to be doing something dramatic, we're going to make sure that we have to speak to as wide a range of stakeholders as we can. Thanks.
Simon and Bon, what do you think about that? Because it seems to me that development finance, or, you know, in the global south, for example, needs to be more patient. Like, it can't be something that just, you know, we turn over very quickly. But I imagine that in your artistic and film practice that you think about time differently. I don't know if you want to make comment on those sorts of issues.
Well, I would like to look at time in terms of the cosmos, and I actually would like to answer by a question to the panel about light pollution and being able to see dark skies, because when you were saying going into the rabbit hole, for us to have an expansive view of how we can go forward, it's a huge problem not being able to see the stars, because if we're learning from Indigenous knowledge, I know with Lakota culture, the word kapemini is what is above is below. And I collaborated on a paper with an astronomer and an astrophysicist and an astronomer on whitening the sky and how light pollution is causing cultural genocide. And I wanted to, even just the idea of our buildings, so I wanted to ask from a planning perspective, our buildings create so much light pollution. And in terms of even just, being able to read the stars and know what direction we're if we're losing our knowledge. And I really wanted to ask from an architectural perspective and a planning perspective about light pollution. I guess because I'm suggesting in regards to time, it's almost like we need to make small systemic changes, and I think light pollution is something quite as one way that we could be looking at slowing down time, slowing down the process of our impending extinction.
Melanie, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, what comes to my mind is, the great example of, light pollution. This is sort of, no one set out to sort of, block out the stars, but a whole series of decisions about our built form and, drivers of urbanisation or whatever are responsible for that phenomenon. And we're really talking about kind of unintended but significant consequences for nature, but also, as you point out, Bon, for humanity. And it goes again to that need for thinking about systems. So too often I think we think in stepwise, linear fashion. We think about individual sectors, so a building in isolation rather than it part of a larger urban system, a particular policy or strategy without its broader context and flow-on consequences that are often unconsidered. So I think it's going back to some of the things that other panelists have highlighted about our need to see human action as part of a global planetary system, and if we then make our decisions about our cities and urban areas, about our international policy in that context, I think we'd do a lot better, rather than just making sort of isolated decisions which might tick a few boxes, but we don't think holistically. And I think with my limited understanding, I think that's where Indigenous knowledges can really help us to think in a much more holistic and interconnected way, rather than with the Western viewpoint of kind of economic gain and sectoral limitations.
Simon, thank you. I wanted to ask you as well, because I'm learning from Indigenous knowledge. I'm learning this concept of time, where making decisions that from a perspective of 7 generations into the future, how will that affect? This is like I first learned this concept from a Canadian industrial design scholar in a amazing conference, Go Back to Where You Came From, that was hosted by the School of Design in 2018. And also Simon, I mean, if it's appropriate for you to speak about the time from an Aboriginal perspective, because what I'm learning is that the past and the future and the present are all existing at the same time. But I was wondering if you could talk about that.
To what I know for sure. There's a vastly different concept of time, obviously, with Indigenous people, certainly from this country and around the world. But essentially, it's not a linear thing at all. It's like you say, it exists in one place at the moment right now, and it's connected to the dreaming as well. And it's those philosophies and concepts and ideas that kind of underpin all of those relationships that the human has to the environment and the human has to the rock and the tree and the water, who are also entities. They exist as real living things, and they're personified in a myriad of different ways. The elements, and so you have that relationship, with all those things, from an Indigenous perspective, the Victorian Aboriginal people were there when Tasmania separated from the mainland. They have stories about that process happening. The New South Wales mob that were out at Lake Eyre and the Western New South Wales, lakes that dried up over 10,000 years. There were people there that had those stories, and they adapted. They had to do something different, and their stories changed as well when those natural phenomena happened. So it's definitely a bigger time scale, but they dealt with a lot of similar things in many ways. But I think it's just the way that they dealt with it, and this. Unfortunately, I keep coming back to this point of profit and money and extraction, and so it's got to be a buck in it for people for corporates to kind of change their approach to things, and maybe we need less focus on the money side of it and more focus on the human side of it. Just kind of leave the money out of it for a while and figure out what's going to be best for people, not what's going to be good for corporations. But that's a really hard challenge. I think it's only people that can do it. In a sense, I think it's like you've got to find a way around the governments. You've just got to leave them behind in some capacity. You've just got to have a community, momentum that's going to do it regardless of what government ideas are.
I'd also like to add, I haven't really spoken about my neurodiversity, and through the way I process and read text, I mean, it has many advantages, I think, in innovative ways, but it's also led me to research when text was first created, when we first started using, when Western Europe first started using text, and how that was introduced to other countries. And it was initially only for men to use, and it was obviously very much revolved around scholastic, education to become to learn about the church initially. And I would like to just throw something in the mix by saying I would love education to be oral, where you're listening and learning from people talking, and having to memorize and acknowledge and learning from Indigenous people how to memorize in a way that is in a way that's accurate. And this is a huge skill that we've lost. Our society is so based around text, and people that succeed in society are often very good writers, or they have good editors. And I think it would be amazing that if we can learn from Indigenous ways of listening and speaking and memory to look at society differently. And I think something I didn't mention before is, Indigenous knowledge is holistic, and so there's so many things. So if you talk about one thing, this is what I'm learning anyway. If you talk about one thing, it encompasses so many things. And I think for our institutions to become transdisciplinary is also so less text-based and more transdisciplinary. I think that would really create a pathway forward.
That's actually exactly the panel we're going to have at the Melbourne Design Week as well in the NGV, which is what the title is Decolonizing Architectural Education, but it is based on discussions with Indigenous voices and educators who bring Indigenous knowledge into the academy and into architectural education as one point of bringing other voices in and changing perspective, which also then changes possibly the perspective of the system thinking and our approach how we relate to the world. And I think that's where the power in education lies, with that because I come back to Janine in a way, it's urgent. So education is like a 3 or 5 year education. If those young architects, designers, artists, environmentalists go into practice, they can shift practice because they bring another attitude to practice and maybe even demonstrate that it's possible to achieve something. And they might have not just an opinion, but they might have a proposal because they explored something in our educational system. I think that's really one of the strengths I always see in education. It's possibly the only reason I'm in education, because it can change things very quickly. It hasn't got because you reach a lot of people. So I think that's really one of the powerful things. But I want to, if I may, because I know we're coming late, we're running a bit out of time, but I wanted to come back to Melanie and really onto our own home turf in the city of Melbourne, because Janine said, 2030, that's only 8 years away. So what is it what we could do, and what is it what the city does, or where we could become part of? Because the city is us. City is based on citizens and it elects representatives. But it's us and the city. What is there we could contribute, and what are the plans by the city to actually address by 2030? Or is that not a time frame Melbourne City thinks in?
Yeah, good question. So yes, in my role, I am working with the City of Melbourne on a program of urban resilience, and that involves kind of co-designing research around these questions. And as I said at the beginning, we need we need local governments, as you know, the level of government closest to the people, to be engaged in this space around resilience. And really, what's really pleasing to see is that the City of Melbourne have committed to a 5-year major initiative around community resilience to disasters, and the real focus being on preparedness to disasters. So I think very often we respond in a reactive way. So what can we do as citizens, as well as governments, to help us prepare for what is an inevitable thing, that we have crises. We have shocks, and we have stresses, which are those sort of slower burn issues that impact on our society. And how do we prepare for what is to come? And I think really important to acknowledge that it's not too late. Like Janine said, we could turn things around and sort of mitigate the worst case scenarios around climate and biodiversity loss, etc., if we act really fast as a global community. But we also have to be realistic about the fact that we have already experienced the impacts of changing weather and changing climate, and will continue to. So we need to be thinking about preparing ourselves for what is unfortunately locked in to a certain extent. And I guess we often turn our minds to thinking about natural disasters, but we also need to be thinking about I guess you can frame this current pandemic as a natural disaster of a kind because of the interrelationship between humans and environment, but certainly economic fallout, all of these things we need to actually be thinking about ahead of time so that we can prevent the worst consequences of those for society, and particularly that widening of inequity. So we know that when we have issues that disasters or even more foreseen issues, that they tend to disproportionately affect people who are already disadvantaged, and so we get that widening of inequity. So in our preparedness and in our resilience building, how do we ensure that we don't let that happen? That we actually we don't let people fall behind, and that we can best support everyone to thrive in the face of a changing world. So it's really great to see that happening at the City of Melbourne. They're certainly not alone in this space, that there's a global network of local governments and other levels of government that are interested in questions around building resilience, both responding to issues but also preparing for. And I think also in that resilience conversation, we do not need to, we must not lose sight of the fact that the ultimate way of building our resilience is to prevent issues happening in the first place. And when we're talking about the Anthropocene and we're talking about climate change as the pressing, headline public health and societal issues of our time, we really need to be thinking about what can we do to stop this, to stop that train, as fast as possible.
Well, I think time to probably wrap it up. We've got a little bit of time left, but before we do, it's been a great conversation. I guess the big thing I've learned is probably at the very beginning that we're still in the pandemic. There is no post-pandemic, and I think that's interesting for me because I think too often, I think too often we think about something just finishes and that's it, and there's kind of a separation or a segmentation to the next bit when often things are much more overlapping in time. Now, Simon and Bon, a quick soundbite or thing that you might want to say to, and Janine, a thing that, and of course, Melanie, a thing that you might want to leave us with before we wrap it up?
Well, I'd just like to talk about the importance of the trickster and the contrarian. Identifying as lightning and the ghost of Bon Scott. He was on the highway to hell and he couldn't get there fast enough. So yeah, I think reversing things, looking at humor and looking at contradiction is the contrary of what society is always looking at, is a really helpful way to keep society progressing forward. Yeah, Simon?
Thanks, Bon. Yeah, I was going to say that, you know, there's a lot of value you can get from Indigenous ways of thinking that you can apply to modern day situations. And yeah, I would just encourage more people, you know, planners, architects, you know, local government, council, all kinds of people to engage, you know, more with Indigenous ideas and concepts. Yep.
I just want to quickly add on that engaging with Indigenous artists and community, it takes many years. So it's something that I urge everyone to do, because it's not something you can do immediately. I just collaborate with an Indigenous person. It takes and there's good reason. It takes a lot of relationship, a lot of time to create this trust to collaborate with Indigenous people. So Simon, I absolutely agree with you, and I'm urging people to do it as soon as they can, because it takes time and we don't have a lot of time.
Yeah, so thank you, Simon and Bon. And I certainly agree with those sentiments about developing those relationships over time, and we do need to develop them quickly. Now, Melanie, what would you like to leave us with?
You know, for me, this period of history is really just a wake-up call for all peoples to acknowledge the interconnected nature of our world, that humans are, you know, part of a planet and a broader system. And I think the pandemic, disastrous as it has been, hopefully has taught some of us in much more stark and personal terms how that relationship between humans and other animals, plants and the earth systems you know, can confront each other and cause massive disruption, and it creates a real drive and impetus for us to change our ways of doing things. That's what I'd like to see.
Great, Janine, and then I think Rockers can do a wrap after that.
Thank you very much. I think there's no better line or framing that I can think of than what Mart and Simon mentioned about the Indigenous perspective on time, that the past, present, and future are with us. And if we don't get more voices at the table now, we will lose the opportunity to actually make a difference. We need an equity safety net, not just a social safety net, an equity safety net. And I think in terms of systems, whether it is at the local, national, or global, it applies as a high priority for us to take the right action moving forward. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks to all the panelists for tonight, and thanks for everyone to tuning in. I like to point out that on the MSD YouTube channel, we have a discussion from last year's MSD at Home and Melbourne Design Week, which is on Indigenous knowledge system and talks about these sorts of collaborations. We also have a forthcoming panel at the NGV on the 25th, which talks about decolonizing architectural education. And Peter and I have a panel at the Sustainability Science Conference in Helsinki in May, which we hope to get a recording of and share with everyone in this space. So there's a lot of food for thought, and that was the provocations we ask everyone. to bring to the table thoughts, food for thought and provocations to get us thinking, but hopefully also to get us acting. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Rockers. Great to be here with you again. And great to see everyone, especially Bon and Simon. Thank you so much. And Melanie, I think my office might be near yours now. And Janine, I'm pretty keen to catch up soon and have a coffee and talk about the UN Habitat, global systems, all things COP. So I think it's been a really great, it's been a great panel because we've got so many different diverse voices that have come to it from different scales. And I think that's really important. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys.